Service Bureau's Partner in Parenting podcast. My name is Mary Gugesberg. I am the Youth and Family Education Coordinator, and today my guest is Gina Johnson. Part of the services we offer is chemical health services, and we thought it'd be great to just take a deeper look at substances, and we're going to use today's conversation is about our students and vaping.
I'm Gina Johnson. I'm the chemical health prevention specialist, and I work in the South Washington County School District. So my prevention role is really doing a lot of these education series. The reason why talking about vaping and tobacco in general really is important to me is it's something that I've been working on for probably about 8 years now. And I just feel like, especially with vaping and electronic cigarettes, there just isn't that much known and that much information out there. So I want to make sure parents and students and everyone we're all kind of on the same page. So that's why I think it's important to talk about, especially doing this series.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I want to tell you also that the mission of Youth Service Bureau is helping youth and their families learn the skills they need to be more successful at home, in schools, and throughout their community. You'll see our service areas there on the screen. Though we're going to just take that deeper look today on helping equip families to have conversations around the electronic cigarettes and how to come alongside and care for their kids.
So first, I wanted to kind of talk about the lingo that usually kids will talk about, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page, like I mentioned earlier. So ENDS is an abbreviation for Electronic Nicotine Delivery System, and you really probably won't hear young people saying that term, but a lot of times that's what medical professionals will use. And so that is anything that is delivering nicotine to you electronically. And then we have the e-cigarette vape mod. It's important to talk about this with young people because oftentimes I hear like vaping and using an electronic cigarette are different, but really they're all the same thing. We're all talking about those ends. Juul is a device that looks like a USB. The reason that is important to know is because it's one of the most popular e-cigarette devices right now. I think it's kind of becoming a little bit less popular among young people, but it's still the most popular. Rip or hit is the act of using an electronic cigarette. A dab cart is also for an e-cigarette or a vape device, but it's going to hold marijuana concentrate. So if you hear your kid talking about a dab cart, you need to not just be aware of nicotine use, but now maybe marijuana use as well. THC is just the abbreviated term or easier way to talk about marijuana. So it's the mind-altering substance found in marijuana, and it's what gets you high. And then NIC-SIC is important to know because it's what young people will call nicotine poisoning, and really it's a nicotine overdose. So you are getting too much nicotine in your body, likely because you're just not used to that amount. And you're going to experience probably dizziness, nausea, loss of consciousness, so you might black out. It's really scary. And it's something that young people or students are just starting to talk about more in like the last 4 months of, oh, I experienced that too. It was really scary. So when they talk about it, some even say like they thought they were dying. They had no idea what this was. They didn't know what was happening to them. So it's important to know the signs.
Perfect. I agree. And, you know, as a parent, having the language is going to help already open my eyes to having these conversations with my own children. So thanks.
Yeah. So I thought it was important to just kind of talk on a broader term right off the bat about tobacco. Tobacco is the #1 leading cause of death, preventable death and disease in the world. It kills 480,000 people every year. So that's 500,000 people. That's a lot of people. And usually when you hear about tobacco, you might think just of like commercial cigarettes, but it's a lot of different things that it could be talking about. We could be talking about chewing tobacco, the cigarettes. We could be talking about cigars or cigarillos, which are little cigars. Or we could be talking about the electronic cigarettes. So all of those are going to be classified as a tobacco product. which means, especially for young people, that means you have to be of legal age to purchase any of those products. So right now the legal age is 21. So this is just a little infographic about the different health effects or cancers that tobacco could cause. I believe, or I know, that tobacco basically can cause a disease or illness in just about any part in your body. So as you can see, there's a lot of different cancers, there's a lot of different diseases. It's important because I like to try and compare and show the similarities to vaping to just using a traditional cigarette.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to talk too much about like general tobacco. Really, this is about vaping, but just so you guys know. So let's get into talking about vaping. So these are all vaping devices. We have on the very top of the screen, we have what we call the evolution of vape devices or electronic cigarettes. So on your far left, we have one of those first devices that was created, and it looks very similar to a cigarette. So it even glows with an orange hue. Then we kind of slowly move into the middle, and those are more of the second generations, so they're a little bit older now. But we have the vape pen, a mod, which is that bigger tank device. Let's see if I can get my pen. So that's a mod right there. Those you don't often find among young people anymore just because they're so bulky. And then we have, on the far right, we have a pod-based system. So we'll talk more about that a little bit in the end, but those are what are really popular among young people right now. And then we have that Juul that I was talking about. The other pieces to this are just some of the like pods that nicotine will come in. So that's these right here. These are the Juul pods, and that's where you get the flavoring. We have right here, this is e-juice. So that would go actually in this vape device right here. And then we have the puff bars, which is becoming increasingly popular among young people. And we can talk about that of why in just a few minutes. But I also think it's important, if it's okay, to talk about the history.
Oh, yeah,
so electronic cigarettes were created in China by a Chinese pharmacist who was actually trying to help people quit smoking. So really his whole reason he made this was for a great reason. He wanted people not to die from all of those diseases and cancers I just showed you. But unfortunately, when it came to the US, the tobacco companies did not want it to be regulated like a cessation device. And so a cessation device is something that helps you quit smoking. You know, there's a lot of reasons why, but I've heard that it was because they just didn't want to spend the time and money to get regulated. So that's actually why you will never see on like a commercial or a magazine ad that these devices are considered a cessation device. You might see random people that are saying, hey, this helped me quit, but they haven't actually been able to prove that it does in fact help people quit. So that's what I'd like to tell young people too, because, you know, oftentimes people don't know why they were created or why this great device is now being used by so many people. And that's really kind of a pretty brief description of the history.
Sure. Gina, you said a pharmacist designed it. Where could I buy these if I were wanting to purchase one?
Yeah. That's a great question. So you could really buy them just about anywhere, unfortunately. You can buy them online. You could get them at a convenience store. So you're probably not going to find as many of those like name brands at a convenience store, but you'll be able to find like Juul. There's these things called vape shops or vape lounges, where if you are over the age of 21, you could go in, purchase them. Sometimes you can even try out the flavors, which to me is kind of alarming. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, young people, unfortunately, they can buy them from older people, so off the streets as well. And I have a slide that talks about how many kids are actually using these products, and we can also talk about really where are kids getting them from.
Great. I welcome it. That's, I think, a question a lot of parents are wondering, so thank you. That'd be great.
Yeah. So this is just kind of a basic slide about the anatomy of an electronic cigarette or a vape device. Really, it's just important for you to see that there is the mouthpiece, there's a battery, usually it's a lithium battery, just like our cell phones. Then it has a like microprocessor, just some complicated pieces to it. But just knowing that, you know, not all of the e-cigarettes look this way, but just about all of them work in this way. And then I just have the definition of what an e-cigarette is. So it's a battery operated device that heats a liquid, and that's usually e-juice or e-liquid, and it turns it into an aerosol that the user will inhale.
Thank you.
So now talking a little bit more about the aerosol. The reason I think this is important for adults and really for anybody to know is when vaping became popular, they wanted to try and stay away from the same language that like smokers would use. So they started calling that cloud of smoke that was coming out of it, they started calling it a vapor. And for medical professionals, we felt that that was very, or health professionals, we felt like that was very confusing for people who didn't really know what you were getting. So they actually changed the term to aerosol, and that is just a very broad term saying like, hey, it's not just water in here, it's other chemicals as well. So this is a nice little picture that I like to share, just kind of showing some of the things you could be finding in that aerosol. So we know that secondhand smoke from cigarettes is dangerous. We're also now learning that maybe that secondhand aerosol is also dangerous as well, because if you're going near somebody who's blowing out this aerosol, you might then be inhaling some of these chemicals as well.
That completely makes sense, right? And if you're riding in the car with someone and they're vaping, so it makes complete sense.
Yeah. Now, this is
Wow.
I think it's a great image to show young people. And I think it's also very important for anyone really to see that it's not just, water or nicotine or flavoring in these, found in these e-cigarette aerosols. It's basically all of these. So I've counted them, it's about 50 to 60 different chemicals. And that's just as of probably like 2017, 2018. So who knows what they're putting in. Unfortunately, electronic cigarettes aren't really regulated very well, meaning the companies that make these products could honestly put whatever they want in it and they don't have to label it. So at the beginning, when I first started working on this, that was one of the biggest things we were worried and scared about, because it's like, you could put whatever you wanted in this. So on this picture, all of the chemicals in orange, which are highlighted, have been shown as either harmful or potentially harmful for us to be inhaling or for us to be putting into our body. So as you can see, some of them are chemicals you might know, like lead, acetone, so nail polish remover. Then we have other ones that are very hard to pronounce. And I like to show these to kids because it's like, that's what you're putting into your body. And, oftentimes they don't know. So,
Yeah. So super scary. Super scary.
yeah. Yeah. And like I said, some of these chemicals are almost always found in the products, but it doesn't mean that all of these chemicals are found in them. Because sometimes I get maybe in conversations with people who say, I don't think, there's zinc in here, or I don't think potassium is going to do me any harm. And it's like, well, you don't know because you're inhaling it instead of actually like putting it into your mouth or, putting it intravenously. So we don't know.
Good point. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, in that like much earlier slide talking about those pod-based devices. So those have become popular probably within just the last maybe 3 years. And really it was because of Juul. And they do things a little bit differently than the other electronic cigarettes, like those vape pens. So they use a pod, which is on the screen, but they also use nicotine salts. And that is kind of a trick used by tobacco companies, but it's to actually decrease the pH in the product, making it easier for somebody to use this product and not feel like a cough or a scratchy throat right away, but then you're getting a lot more nicotine. So these products have sometimes, and I have a nice little picture in the next slide, but sometimes, double or triple the amount of nicotine you would find in a traditional cigarette. Um, and then I often hear, well, how many puffs do you think would be equivalent to one pod? So there's about 200 puffs of, using that jewel to be empty. So you're getting about 200 puffs. So it's important because if you do suspect your kid uses or you do know they use, it's important to know how many pods they're going through, because it's not the same thing as a commercial cigarette where, you maybe get 3 puffs out of it, you put it to the side, then you have to relight it. So you're like consciously aware of how much you're using it. Whereas, Juul or the Fix or the Soren, they're just basically, you're not paying attention to when you're using it. So you're putting up to your mouth, taking a puff, putting it down. You're not getting those same cues. So some kids are actually going through like 2 to 3 pods a day, and that is a lot. So that's why it's important to know how many pods they're going through.
Thank you. Yeah. How much is a pod? Do you have a guess?
So one pod, I don't have probably a good guess of what one pod would be, but so like Juul, you could get a starter pack. So that was 1 Juul, 1 battery, and 4 flavors for about $40. And then the flavors you could buy individually, like in a pack of 4, and that was about $15. So I guess you could do the math. So some people say it's cheaper than using cigarettes because a pack of cigarettes is about $9 to $10. But depending on how many pods you're using, it could be more.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So this is that image that I was talking about that just shows the comparison of how much nicotine you're getting to how much nicotine you would be getting in a cigarette. And this is really where the nic sip kind of comes in, because you maybe didn't know how much nicotine you were getting. For a long time, Juul and some of those other vape companies weren't really making it obvious of how much nicotine they were putting in their product. But now we do know that the Juul pod has about 41 milligrams of nicotine. And even that's confusing because it's like, how much are you getting per puff? So they did figure out it's about equivalent to 20 cigarettes for an entire pod. Then we have the Fix and the Soren, which are also very popular as well. And that's, double the amount and even more. So that's when kids are, never using these products before and then going to use one of these, and that's when they start feeling sick. So it's important to know how much nicotine you're actually getting.
Wow. Yeah, I love this graph. That's super helpful information. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think it's unfortunate too, because some of these companies know that it's kind of hard and confusing to know how much nicotine you're getting. So some of these newer companies are putting even more nicotine in their product.
Well,
and like I said, with that nicotine salt, you're going to be able to absorb it a lot faster and much easier.
Again, another scary thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving on to talking about the health effects of what vaping can cause. So for a long time, even just in the last year or two, we really didn't know any of the effects or side effects that would happen if we chose to vape. But we do know now that a lot of those chemicals mimic or are very similar to what a cigarette would do. So vaping hurts your lungs, heart, and blood vessel, and it gets kind of complicated, but some of the chemicals actually taking out oxygen from your lungs, or from your blood, sorry. And so that makes it harder for you to breathe, makes your heart not work as well. And so we're seeing with vaping that it can really decrease your immune system. And especially right now with the coronavirus, they were trying to highlight the dangers of vaping and the coronavirus because, one, it's going to affect your lungs, and so it's going to make it harder for you to breathe. And two, if you were potentially to get coronavirus, it would take you a lot longer to heal. So that's one thing that I like to tell the kids of, like, you think you have a really great immune system, but if you're going to put any substance into your body, so it could be really any drug, it's going to probably decrease your immune system. So it's going to be harder for you to fight off those, the flu, the cold, coronavirus. So those are some things that we're starting to see And that's just within like the last year or two. Then we also saw about 6 months ago, people were starting to actually die from vaping, and it was very scary. They were basically telling adults, young people, to absolutely just quit vaping because we didn't know why people were just randomly dying from using this product. Thankfully, they were able to figure it out that it was a chemical or an ingredient that was being added, vitamin E acetate. And usually you will only find that in ones that also have marijuana concentrates. But still, I mean, like I said, people don't have to put what they're putting into these products. So that was just one, unfortunately, good example of health effects to different chemicals being added.
And you said don't know what's in them because they're not regulated.
Right. Yeah.
Another worry for a parent.
Yeah, for sure. And then another one that I really like to talk about is vaping can lead to a nicotine addiction. And this is one of our biggest worries for young people because young people are more prone to addiction just because our brains aren't fully developed at that age. And the earlier you start using any type of drug, the more likely your chances to develop either an addiction now or even later on in your life. So vaping addiction or dependence can be very scary because kids, honestly, they didn't even know they could become addicted. Some kids didn't know there was even nicotine in their products, but now they're, using the product every single day, and then they find out there's nicotine in it. So we like to tell kids about 99% of the time you're going to find nicotine in those products. And nicotine, I don't think I have a slide on this, but nicotine is one of the most addicting drugs in the world. And sometimes I think it gets kind of pushed behind some of those like harder drugs like heroin, meth, but it's very hard to quit once you start.
And I'm assuming we're going to talk about that eventually, right? The quitting.
Yeah, yep.
Perfect. Good.
So then this is a slide taken from the Minnesota Student Survey. It's a survey done every 3 years, and it's one of our best data points. So in Minnesota. So this is specific to Washington County, but I would say that just about all of the data is fairly similar. So as you can tell, and the reason why we're talking about this is because electronic cigarettes have become so much more popular just in the last couple of years. So a quote that I wanted to include was from 2017 to 2019, electronic cigarettes, so vaping, has become popular among high school students. It rose by 135%.
Wow.
And that's when the CDC, the Surgeon General, they put out that warning saying this is an epidemic because kids were using it at such a high rate. And it's really interesting to me because, there's so many people that are supportive of electronic cigarettes, but really we know that it's kids or youth or young people that are vaping at a much higher rate than adults. So adults actually vape at, I believe it's 6%. So 6% of adults use electronic cigarettes. And that data is also taken from a Minnesota adult tobacco survey, so not the same survey, whereas you can see that young people are using at about, what is it? It's like 32%. So it's about 24% for 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. As you can tell, 11th graders are at the highest rate, and that's not super surprising. But I think it's really cool because the US and now Minnesota just passed the you have to be 21 to purchase tobacco because these some 12th graders are actually 18. So they were able to buy their high school friends these tobacco products, and then they were able to use them. So if we can increase the age to 21, you have a less chance of having somebody in high school be 21, or you probably maybe don't have a lot of siblings that are 21 or friends that are 21. So hopefully, that just happened in the last 4 months. hopefully we will see a decline because of that.
Flavorings. Was there regulation on flavorings? Did I remember hearing in the news?
Yeah, so that one's a little complicated. So I'm going to try and explain it the best I can. But flavorings on a federal level were basically prohibited or are now going to be regulated. And it was like the vape juice that I showed you, those were going to be banned from certain places. But there was like a loophole. So if you sold it as a disposable product, um, you could get past that. So that's why earlier I showed that image of the puff bar. It looks like a jewel, it's about this big. So that actually can have all sorts of different flavors to it. And that's because of the loophole that the feds sort of passed, sort of didn't pass. But Juul actually, the one that's most popular, they had to basically cut down most of their flavors. So the only flavors that were allowed were either tobacco flavored or menthol flavored. And I will say, like, there's a lot of research showing that if we could basically prohibit or ban all flavoring, kids likely wouldn't use the products, but it has to be a very strong regulation. So I know that Minnesota eventually is going to be working on that to try and ban all flavoring in Minnesota. So
That might explain why Fix has hit such a great popularity with our students. Thank you. Really great info.
yeah, and then another question you had asked was, where are the kids getting their devices from? And in the Minnesota student survey, they actually asked that question as well. And I don't have a little infographic of it, but 73% of underage students in the last 30 days got their e-cigarettes from a friend or another person, so that makes sense. About 17% of them were able to buy them directly from a store. So they were able to go into a store, even wasn't asked for their ID, and was just able to buy them. So that's really scary. And then, so that would probably be like a convenience store, like a gas station. 9% of them were able to walk into a vape shop and buy them. So that's where you're only allowed to be in there if you are of legal age.
21, correct?
And then about 8% bought them online.
Yeah.
Some of them parents give to them. That's why I think it's important for us to talk about this, because parents oftentimes think vaping is a safer alternative to using cigarettes. And as we learned with those chemicals that I talked about, the different health effects that it can lead to addiction as well, it's really not the case. I like to tell kids, this is kind of corny, but like, if you jumped from a 4-story building, it's safer than jumping from a 16-story building, but it's still not safe. So it's still not going to feel good when it happens. So that's why I like to say, like, no, vaping is not a safer alternative, especially for young people.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this is just a nice little image to show that really those who use e-cigarettes or vape are either likely also going to use commercial tobacco or cigarettes or chewing tobacco, or they already are using both. So 60% of high school vapers use both already. And there's, a lot of different reasons behind that. Some of them, they just weren't able to go buy a new vape device, but they were able to get cigarettes a lot easier, or they already had the cigarettes. There's a lot of reasons behind it. But this is what I think is alarming too, because kids who think, well, I'm only ever going to vape, that's likely actually not the case. You're probably eventually going to switch to cigarettes. And we know that cigarettes kill almost 500,000 people a year. So it's important to know that these are the facts. Now talking about vaping THC or vaping the marijuana. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, these e-cigarettes can be used for other drugs. Usually we will see either nicotine or we will see THC or marijuana. So I just have a couple pictures of what those devices would look like. A lot of, like Juul, you usually cannot use Juul for other drugs because of the pods. Now, some companies are creating devices where you can use both nicotine and THC in their product. And that's becoming a little bit more popular, but it's also probably a little bit harder to get your hands on if you're underage, or if your state doesn't allow marijuana. But it's called dabbing when you vape THC. And the reason it's important to talk about is because when you're vaping THC, especially if it's like in the wax or the oil form, you're getting it at a much higher potency than if you were to use like the leafy marijuana or the dried marijuana. The dried marijuana, leafy marijuana, is about like 14 to 15% THC potency, and these waxes or dab or oils are actually about like 80 to 99% THC. So it's an extremely high level of THC, and it's causing young people to experience delusions, paranoia, psychosis, things that actually are requiring emergency room visits. So kids, they maybe didn't know they were about to vape or dab, and then all of a sudden they get really sick, and it's likely because they were vaping THC, or it could be that really high level of nicotine too. And I like to always throw in talking about THC or marijuana, just because I hear so often like, oh, all of these states are passing or legalizing marijuana, and they're legalizing like the leafy marijuana. They are still legalizing the dabs, but they're much more dangerous to be using, especially for young people. It can cause addiction, in young people or old people. And so I like this picture on the right of the screen just to show like, hey, if you see a vape device in your kid's backpack or in their desk and it looks like one of these, that means it's specifically being used for marijuana.
Good to know.
So now these are, unfortunately, I keep saying unfortunately, these are things that you can hide your vaping device or vaping product. This is usually where I talk about how you can tell if your child or friend is vaping. Usually there's a couple different signs. You might smell this odd sweet smell, so cotton candy or like a blueberry lemonade, and you're like, oh, there's no cotton candy being made near me. Likely that's from a vape device. And then we have like an aerosol cloud. So that cloud I showed you, usually it might be, if they're trying to cover it, it might be coming out of their neck hole or their sleeves.
Oh, sure.
You might just see like a little wisp of it. So that's a sign. A USB charging in the computer, a lot of, the jewel looks just like a USB. So if it's like sticking out of your computer, just don't hesitate to ask. Just say, oh, is that for school? What is that? It's always important to make sure you're talking to your child about this. And then this bottom picture is a hoodie that is sold specifically to be a hands-free vape device. So you use the drawstring and you can put it in your mouth and you can basically just use it like you would be with a jewel. It was actually created for gamers to use, so that they could keep playing on their games and not have to take a break, but kids were starting to buy them as well. I will say that they're pretty expensive. It's like a $60 to $80 hoodie. So oftentimes I don't think like middle schoolers are going to have the money to buy those, but always be aware, especially if it's called vaporware. Some other changes would be frequent nosebleeds or excessive thirst. Those are signs of just using nicotine. And then behavioral changes. Nicotine, like I said, is a drug. It may cause behavioral changes in your child. So mood swings or agitation. Some of these signs are just like, hey, I'm just a teenager. So it's always important to have those conversations.
Good advice.
And then I should just really include for 1 second this Sharpie pen right here. The reason I included that was because you can go on YouTube and there's tons of different videos of how to hide these vape devices. So that one right there is how they're trying to hide it in school.
Thank you.
These are just some signs that I like to talk about of either you're on the path to becoming addicted to nicotine, or you may already have that dependence or addiction. So cravings or feeling like you really need to use nicotine is a sign. Going out of your way to get nicotine, especially for young people, so either you're not of age to purchase, so you either are trying to buy it through Snapchat or social media, sneaking out of the house to go get it, shady meetups with people, that would be a sign of going out of your way, because you're taking those risks. Feeling anxious or irritable if you want to use but can't, so that's a sign of withdrawal. So if you're starting to feel or experience withdrawals from nicotine, that might be a sign that you have started to lean towards an addiction. Continuing to use nicotine because you find it hard to stop. So like I said, nicotine is one of the most addicting drugs in the world. So it's probably going to hit you pretty quick. We were learning that with the levels of nicotine that like Juul, Fix, Soren, Nord were all having in their products, some people were becoming addicted within just a week. So that was pretty scary. And then another one would be having to vape or smoke during the school day. So really these are signs that I talk to young people about of like, if you think you fit any of these, it's time to start reflecting on whether or not you should be quitting. Now, because this podcast is for parents, I wanted to include some ways that we can support young people. And often I hear, oh, I'm just their parent, they're not going to listen to me. That's actually not the case. Parents are the most influential source of information their child has. So if you're able to be a good role model, or if you're even just able to talk about that you think vaping is bad or other drugs are bad, they're listening to that. So it's important to know. And then two of the biggest deterrents of vaping would be one, legal consequences. So just them knowing that it is illegal to use these products, to even have the device, even if there is no nicotine in it, even just to have that on you, you could potentially get a ticket. And then disappointing parents. The reason why I include that is because you can let them know that you will be disappointed or you would be disappointed if they started using substances. Because they might think, it's just a little nicotine, it's just a little marijuana, my parents won't care. But letting them know that you will care. And I think it's important too that these conversations should be ongoing. You can start as early as elementary school or kindergarten talking to your kids about substance use. It doesn't specifically have to be about alcohol or other drugs. You could even just talk about vitamins or prescriptions at a young age, but it should be ongoing. It shouldn't be a one and done conversation.
Gina,
and then some other ways would be, sorry.
Before you go back, go too far, I would also remind parents that remind your kid that you're a product of who you hang out with. And having those healthy, encouraging friends. I always talk about the importance of 5 caring adults in a child's life. So I would just call that out as well. That helps support a young person.
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, talking often to them and listening. It doesn't even have to be about substances. It could just be about talking about their day or, who their friends are or what their friends are doing. Oftentimes, though, for adults, we like to fix the problem. We don't always listen to what the problem is and have the kids fix it on their own. So I like to include would you like me to either listen or would you like my advice? And I think that'll go a long way when you're talking to your kids. Another important piece is being equipped with facts. So this presentation, like I said, I really try and only use facts in it. But you can find a lot of other websites or resources that have the facts. And then I share some at the end of this as well. And then trying to understand their why. So what are you getting out of using this? What are you getting out of drinking or, using any of these drugs, and listening and understanding why maybe they're using it? And so my next slide is actually a list of whys. So these could be, any of these reasons could be why they're using. Mental health is a huge one. So maybe your child has bad anxiety or depression, and they think that using nicotine might help or any other drugs might help. So we call that an unhealthy coping skill. Um, Usually, drugs or substances will only take away those feelings for a very short period of time, but it's not going to fix it. Highly recommend them to go see a therapist, speak to a counselor or to their doctor about their mental health. Another reason is social. They feel pressured to use by their friends because, according to the statistics, likely their friends could be using. So they're pressured to use. They feel like, oh, everybody's using, so if I use, I'm going to fit in with that group. But actually, that's not the case. Actually, it's about 75% of high school students choose not to use any type of drugs. And it's higher for even certain drugs as well. And then some of the other ones, are pretty self-explanatory, but biological factor. If you have addiction in your family, that just means that your child might be a little bit more predisposed to also develop an addiction. So important to let them know that, like, oh, your uncle or your grandma had a very serious addiction, and so now maybe you could develop an addiction as well.
Gina, when having those conversations, the other thing I'd recommend is giving maybe role playing and giving your child advice on when they're in that social setting. If they don't want to, how are you going to decline that invitation? So, and practice it.
Oh, I love that, Mary. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we talk about how to say no. So how to say no if you're feeling pressured to use something or do something you don't want to do. And it does take practice. So usually I'll maybe say, like, go practice this with your child. That's your homework for tonight, of, hey, even make it realistic scenarios too, of, like, maybe the friend wants you to break curfew or something of that, or go hang out with somebody who has coronavirus, or breaking the stay-at-home orders. Those are all great ways to practice saying no.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And then sticking with that no too is also important.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a resource. It's called the Family Dinner Toolkit. We just know that lots of studies and research shows that if you can eat or have any type of meal with your family as a family, you're less likely to use any type of drugs. You're also more likely to have better grades and just a higher self-esteem. So this is a website you could go to get dinner ideas, different things you can talk about, and just different activities during that meal time. And also, it doesn't have to be lunch or dinner. It could even just be breakfast. It could be at any point in the day, just as long as you guys are gathering. And this gives a good time to talk about your day, who your friends are. It just really opens everything up. And then setting limits. A lot of times parents don't know how to set limits for their kids, not just about substance use, but they might even create a limit after the kid gets in trouble. So making sure that you have rules beforehand, and even working with your child to create those rules. So maybe trying to come up with fair things. So if you get caught breaking curfew, what do you guys think is a fair limit or rule to follow? And what's that consequence you're going to receive? So then the kids know already, and then making sure you stick with those limits. So if your child does break curfew and they don't get any of the consequences you talked about, now they know they're probably going to be able to break some of those other rules and not have any consequences. So just sticking with those limits. And then, sorry, another piece to that is some of those consequences, one of my favorite is to actually add an educational piece to it. So if they were, in trouble for using, or for vaping, you could have them go on to some sites, so like Minnesota Department of Health, and actually have them write a paper about, the research done on vaping and why it's harmful for you. Because either you're going to lecture them and they might not listen, or they can do the research themselves. And that's a great piece of a consequence.
Nice.
And then just teaching them healthy coping skills. So like I said, using drugs is an unhealthy coping skill. So teaching them healthy ways. So ways to reduce stress and how to manage your emotions. So one of them would be, yoga, talking to a therapist, deep breathing, regulating your breathing, using a journal to describe the different feelings or emotions you're going through are extremely important. And often I feel like kids are not taught this, especially in school. So ways that you can deal with that depression or that anxiety in your life.
And Gina, we also have if you follow YSB's social media, we recorded a podcast about healthy coping skills. So I'd encourage families to check that out as well.
Yeah, definitely. And then just here are some resources that I think are important to know as a parent or to know for like friends. But you can text QUIT to this number, and it's specifically for young people because, we don't really like talking on the phone. But it will help with a vaping addiction or dependence. And then My Life, My Quit is a online resource you can use for young people as well. And then drugfree.org is a great website for parents to look at different resources and research behind drug use, and then how to talk to your kids about it. Of course, ysb.net, we have a ton of great resources as well, some talking points that you can talk to. So that's a great one. Gobi.support is an early intervention site where you and your child could actually, it's kind of like treatment, but it's not actually going to a treatment facility. And then changethechill.org is one that I love for young people because it's a website you can go on and learn about different ways to deal with your stress, anxiety, depression. It gives you some of those healthy coping skills.
Perfect.
Yeah. And then that's really mostly what I wanted to share. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email me. There's my email.
Gina, this has been great info. Fun idea of, because our kids, where are they getting their information? So I really like helping guide them and have them come back to me as the parent and say, well, here's what I learned, but I want to know their sources. So we'll try to include some of those sites also in this, the description of this education. So thank you. I appreciate, oh my gosh, such great information. You helped build my toolbox, and I'm sure other families will greatly find this of great value as well. So I thank you. I wish you well, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks, Mary.